Hello, I welcome you to Sigazeva Tema, where we celebrate and discuss issues to do with African culture, customs, tradition, and history. May is the month we celebrate Africa Day. Africa Day is just more than a commemoration of the day on which OAU, Organization of African Unity, was formed. On this day, we reflect on African history. We celebrate African culture, knowing too well that in our diversity we are one. It is a day that we attempt to provide an African story. We look at our own history and try to tell it from an African point of view. This is more than just a glorification of African history, but it is an attempt to provide an inside story. To help us celebrate Africa Day this year, we are going to look at the story of an African chief who was executed by the British for being a rebel. In his defense, the chief said, "It is all very well to call me a rebel, but this land belonged to me and my forefathers long before you came here." This is the story of the great chief Chingaira Mutota Makoni. And who was Chief Mutota Makoni? Chief Mutota Makoni has been described differently by different writers and historians. Terence Ranger said Chief Mutota was a warlike chief. Others said he was iron-willed. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, in his book The Mounted Infantry and the Mashonaland Field Force, said Chief Mutota was, and I quote, the biggest chief in Mashonaland, end of quote. Other writers said Chief Makoni was a fine-looking chief, his face normally dignified and sensual, but which could look uncommonly fierce on occasions. That was a historian, J.C. Barnes, describing Chief Mutota Makoni. To help us gain an insight into who was Chief Mutota Makoni, we are going to give you a brief history of Chief Mutota Makoni. Chief Mutota Makoni came to power in 1889 after a fierce succession war with the house of the Nyakurukwa. He faced a claimant that was known as Ndafunya. The succession dispute turned into a civil war, and Chief Mutota Makoni managed to win the succession dispute and was then crowned the new chief. That was in 1889. Upon coming to power, he faced another war against the Manyika, but soon the British would arrive on the scene. In 1890, the British, represented by Cecil John Rhodes, invaded Mashonaland. When they invaded Mashonaland, their major misconception was that all the Shona states were under the Ndebele rule. Thus, they gave themselves an undisputed right to rule Mashonaland. But nothing was further from the truth than that. There are many Shona states that were not under Ndebele rule, and these included Makoni, Simaungwe State, Mutasasi, Manyika State. These states were independent of Ndebele rule, and they never faced any Ndebele raid in their lifetime. The Portuguese, who were in Mozambique, who knew the situation in Zimbabwe very well, were attempting to expand into the Manyika State, and very soon the British found themselves at war with the Portuguese who were in Mozambique. The war between the British and the Portuguese was concluded by the Treaty of Lisbon in 1891, and by that treaty, the Manyika State fell under British rule. But that was not the end. The British soon found themselves at loggerheads with the Boers, who wanted to expand into the Ndebele state. In 1893, to forestall the expansion of the Boers into the Ndebele state, the British invaded the Ndebele state, and its king, Lobengula, fled into exile. That was the end of the Ndebele rule. The destruction of the Ndebele state assured Chief Mutota Makoni that the presence of the British meant nothing other than the loss of independence of the Shona people. From 1893, Chief Mutota Makoni started to prepare for a war of resistance against the British. As it was not even a surprise when in May 1896, Chief Mutota Makoni issued a verbal ultimatum against the British, telling them to leave his own state or face an armed ejection from the Maungwe state. When the Chief Native Commissioner Tebera heard that Chief Mutota Makoni had issued a verbal ultimatum, he said Chief Mutota Makoni, and I quote, was playing up, end of quote. He prepared, and I quote, to teach Chief Mutota Makoni a lesson, end of quote. The Chief Native Commissioner traveled to Headlands, where he wanted to confront Chief Mutota Makoni. But while at Headlands in June, Chief Native Commissioner Tibera heard that the Shona everywhere had risen against the British rule. The immediate concern then was to construct a laager. A laager that was heavily fortified was built at Headlands. But on the 21st of June 1896, Chief Mutota Makoni assaulted the laager. And this is confirmed by the British South African Company reports. The report says Chief Mutota Makoni launched attacks on a laager that was established at Headlands, which had to be abandoned. After the attacks on the laager, Chief Native Commissioner Tebera had to surrender to Chief Makoni. Chief Makoni accepted the surrender and offered a safe corridor for the Chief Native Commissioner and his followers to leave the Maungwe state safely. A historian, A.C. Thompson, acknowledged that the British, and I quote, were not attacked on the way, though there were many positions on the road which they would have found it difficult to get through had they been defended. For surrendering to an African chief, the Chief Native Commissioner came under heavy criticism from his own people. Lieutenant Colonel Alderson, after also facing the Maungwe army, would come to the defense of Chief Native Commissioner and say, there are people who loudly talk about, and I quote, what they would have done and what other people should have done under certain circumstances after the event. They forget that the people on the spot had to act once. Lieutenant Colonel Alderson had arrived in Zimbabwe in command of the mounted infantry. He was first destined to Matabeleland, but when the Mashonaland uprising broke out, he was diverted to go to Mashonaland. His first mission was to attack Chief Mutota Makoni. On the 3rd of August, Lieutenant Colonel Alderson massacred more than 200 civilians who were enjoying a celebration at the royal court. Before the massacre of the civilians, Lieutenant Colonel Alderson had rightly assessed the situation, and he had said that, judging by the sound of the singing, were grouped the last revelers of the night before. He had established the people who were singing to be just revelers. But having established that, he ordered his army to open fire on defenseless women and children who were attending the celebration. But hours later, he had to face the Maungwe army. The Maungwe army was camped in a mountain that was called Gwindingwi. This was Chief Mutota Makoni's fortress. Lieutenant Colonel Alderson tried to dislodge Chief Mutota Makoni from the mountain, but he had to settle for nothing. In his own words, Lieutenant Colonel Alderson said, and I quote, "We were in fact like people rabbiting without a ferret and without a spade, when every rabbit has a gun which he lets off now and then from some fresh, unexpected and unseen bolt hole." Lieutenant Colonel Alderson retreated from Gwindingwi with heavy losses. Some of his men were killed, and these include Captain Haynes, Private Vickers. These were killed in battle. There were so many others who were seriously injured. This was the second victory of Chief Mutota Makoni against the British Army, the first being at Headlands and the second at Gwindingwi. But the last victory came against the backdrop of more than 200 civilians that were massacred by Lieutenant Colonel Alderson. The repulsion of Lieutenant Colonel Alderson from Gwindingwi forced the British to enter into some form of talks with Chief Mutota Makoni, but the talks proved to be drawn out. The sticking point was the British expected Chief Mutota Makoni to surrender, but events on the ground did not compel Chief Mutota Makoni to surrender. To push forward their agenda, the British set up a team that was made up of Sergeant Hanyani, who was a native policeman, Secretary, who was known to Chief Mutota Makoni, Tom Dlamini, who was a Swas, and Mandishona, who was a messenger. This is the team that visited Chief Mutota Makoni at Gwindingwi and tried to persuade him to surrender. As the talks dragged on, Lieutenant Colonel Alderson, who was now in Harare, by then Salisbury, dispatched Major Watts to go to Gwindingwi and oversee the talks and also to oversee the laying down of arms. Upon his arrival, Major Watts started to attack innocent civilians. This also forced Chief Mutota Makoni to agree to meet the British. Contrary to common perception, Chief Mutota Makoni emerged from Gwindingwi on the 30th of August. He was also misled by Tom Dlamini, who promised him peace. But soon after he left Gwindingwi, Chief Mutota Makoni found himself under arrest. He was arrested together with his councillors and was taken in as a prisoner. On the 3rd of September, Chief Mutota Makoni went under a drumhead trial. He was charged with being a rebel and he was found guilty. He was condemned. On the next day, the 4th of September 1896, Chief Mutota Makoni was executed by a firing squad. In charge of that firing squad was a man who was called Colin Harding. Colin Harding said about Chief Mutota Makoni, and I quote, "Makoni died a brave man, whether he was a murderer, a rebel, or a devil incarnate." This is found in his book, Far Bagels. In his other book, Frontier Patrols, Colin Harding said, "Makoni was certainly a rebel, and with equal conviction, I found him a brave man." Another British historian added his voice to the execution of Chief Makoni. H.C. Thompson wrote that Chief Mutota Makoni died with courage and dignity that extorted an unwilling admiration from all who were present. He also added that he had met a respected man in Salisbury, now Harare, who had said, and he quoted, I know of nothing greater than Makoni's death than the quiet way in which he spoke to his people and told them to abstain from further resistance. After his execution, his head was decapitated and sent to Britain. It is alleged that Chief Mutota's head is in a museum. The British went on to install a puppet chief, Ndafunya. Ndafunya had proved to be a pro-imperialist, and he had also aided the invasion of Gwindingwi. It is important to note that Ndafunya was a member of the royal family who had been involved, as earlier mentioned, in a succession dispute with Chief Mutota Makoni. Ndafunya's first actions was to destroy all the fortification around Gwindingwi. This is the story of Chief Mutota Makoni, a story of a brother betraying a brother, a story of courage and dignity, a story of trying to make it against all odds. As Africa today, we must face the future with courage and dignity. No matter the circumstances we find ourselves in, no matter the circumstances Africa will find itself in, Africans should face the future with courage and dignity. We can't afford not to be brave. We can't afford to be cowards. We are from a line of rulers who were not cowards. Our forefathers were not cowards. Our forefathers were brave men. We should copy from our forefathers. We should copy from our ancestors. We should have courage and dignity to face all the circumstances that we might come across. One day, Africa will make it. With courage and dignity, Africa will one day rise. Arise, Africa. Arise, motherland. Have a good Africa Day. Thank you.